Okay, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Thrilled to be with you. This is a topic that you'll see is very near and dear to my heart. And I'm excited to tell you about the work of really a big team, many of whom are in the audience, so you'll have that opportunity to ask them detailed questions if you want. We're talking about roads to removal. These are different ways that we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. There are executive summaries out in the hall if you'd like to dig in a little bit further. But first I want to talk about why did we write this report? Why are we even here talking about climate tech and the scale up?
As a scientist, I know by the time she takes her first breath, 9 billion more tons of carbon pollution will be in the air. When she takes her first steps, wildfires will have burned millions more acres she could have explored. The day she gets her first pet, there are thousands of newly extinct species she'll never meet. The night she forgets to call, the night of her first heartbreak. Her future home floods for the first of many times. By the time a child born today goes to college, it may be too late to leave them the world we promised. Our window to act on climate change is like watching them grow up. We blink and we miss it.
I realize that's a very sobering and intense way to start. But it's what we need to face, that later is too late, that we're facing a truly sobering climate crisis on this planet. But what I want to tell you about today is that there are many opportunities where we, as a community, as a nation, can make a real difference and can make that happen soon. And at the same time, building jobs, building new industries. And the Tri-Valley area is absolutely central to that, largely because of our knowledge of what the opportunities are. And that's what I want to kind of tell you about today. So this is one of the nerdy graphs we like to show where we think about decarbonization. That's a big fancy word for saying we need to get that CO2 out of the air. We need to get those greenhouse gases out of our atmosphere, back in the ground. That's where it started, back in our soils, back deep underground where fossil fuels were extracted. And part of that is electrifying, buying an EV, taking those industries like steel and cement that produce a lot of greenhouse gases and starting to find ways that we can reduce the climate impacts. And all of that work, which is essential, it's sort of 90% of the problem, is in the gray area of this curve. And it's taking down the emissions rate to zero. But the reality is we know it's going to be tough to get to zero. Not everybody's going to buy an EV. Not every industry is going to have a technological solution to transform. And we have agriculture and other industries that are just going to continue to produce greenhouse gases. So we actually have to make up for those legacy emissions which we've created in the past decades, but also make up for the fact that we know we're not going to be able to decarbonize enough. So we have a sort of 10 to 15% solution that's in the green area, which is the need to net remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then when you do that and you balance that out with the carbon dioxide removal, with the emissions reductions, then that's how you get to what we call net zero. And our goal is to get there as a state by 2045, as a nation by 2050. Those dates are coming up soon. And the national goal is that we would remove something on the order of 1 billion tons of CO2 by the year 2050. Start to remove that amount per year. Now, why did we think that we needed to do an analysis of that number? Well, we really want to establish not just what that goal is, but can we make that goal? That was established by politicians, by smart people in Washington and the International Panel on Climate Change. But do we have the resources? Have we got the biomass? Have we got the land, the workforce, the know-how to meet those goals? Well, my colleague Sarah Baker, who's here with us, led an analysis for the state of California several years ago and established in the Getting to Neutral report that, yeah, we can do that for the state of California by 2045. So what we then decided is let's do a whole national analysis. Let's look at all 3,300 counties across the whole nation and try to see if all of those resources exist and what would be the impacts on communities. So that's what this analysis was. We collected folks from all across the country in academic institutions and other national laboratories. Our colleagues in Washington were part of the vetting process. The Department of Energy provided the funding for this work. And it's really a bottom-up analysis. It really is, instead of a kind of modeling approach, we really just looked at what are our resources? What is the existing amount of geologic pore space? What's the existing amount of agricultural land we have to work with? What are the brass tacks? We really tried to avoid kind of finger wagging. This is not meant to be a policy document. And that needs to come, but this is really just to lay the ground of what's possible. A lot of cross-cutting analyses, you'll see that as I go through the talk. But if you want to learn more, roadstoremoval.org is a real easy website to remember. It's also in those executive summaries. For those of you who are educators or students in the audience, I want to point out that there's some great little fact sheets, short videos. If you're ever in a situation where you want to share that information with a class or others, we really tried to bring it down to the level that is approachable for the general public. So, what is carbon dioxide removal? We start with carbon dioxide in the air. I like to make the joke that plants are the OG of carbon dioxide removal because photosynthesis is all about capturing CO2 and turning it into their biomass. That just means, it's a fancy word that means the tree trunks, the roots, the stems of those trees. Now, if we put carbon dioxide back in trees, in many parts of the country, in many parts of the world, it will stay there for hundreds of years because those trees are long-lived. But we here in California know what happens to our forests with some regularity, unfortunately growing regularity. That carbon is not always durably stored because we have such a high risk of wildfire. But it is at least initially captured there. We can also increase the amount of carbon that's pushed below ground into soils and agricultural systems. And that's just plants literally pushing carbon down into their roots, sharing it with microorganisms, and there are many processes where that carbon can be stored. And we can encourage that process in a number of ways. All of those more natural or ecological solutions are very important. And I would argue they're things that we can do literally today. It's not high tech. We know how to do those approaches. We start to move into the more tech world when we think about capturing some of that biomass. Maybe if we're up in the Sierras and we're thinning some of those forests that have overgrown, or if we're on our ag lands in the Central Valley and we're collecting rice hulls or nut orchards that are being turned over. All of that biomass that currently was either burned or allowed to just decompose and be re-released to the atmosphere, we can truck that to a facility where it's refined into various products and we capture the CO2 at the same time. And I'll talk more about that process, but as an acronym, we call that BICRS, which stands for Biomass Carbon Removal and Storage. We can get biomass from other sources, not just ag or forestry, but just simple municipal waste. You probably have a green bin. I hope you fill it up every week. And it goes off right now to probably a composting facility. That's great. But we could actually capture even more of that carbon if we took it to a BICRS facility and we're making hydrogen as well as capturing that CO2. Now, the last kind of CDR, or carbon dioxide removal, you might have heard about is direct air capture and storage, or DAC. A lot of investment coming from the federal government right now for these pilot facilities. You might have heard of there's one out in Tracy you can go visit called Heirloom. And these are literally giant fans working in reverse, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and running it across a solvent or sorbent and capturing that CO2 that then can be concentrated. And the whole process is generated to inject CO2 either below ground into a deep geologic storage facility or added into cement or other useful products where we use CO2. So all of these approaches are really mature technology today. There is new tech that's certainly needed, but all of these approaches are well understood today. That's why we could do this analysis, is because it's so well known. So I'm going to skip to the answer. I'm not going to make you wait. The answer is absolutely. We can achieve 1 billion tons of removals of CO2 every year by the time we get to 2050. We have those resources, and we can scale up to build enough facilities to do this work by the time we get to 2050. It's going to cost, though. It's going to cost $129, let's say $130 billion a year. And I like to usually look people in the eye, but it's hard with the lights in here to see, is that a big number to you, or is that actually that's only 0.5% of our GDP. We can handle that as a nation. It's far less than we're starting to pay in cleanup costs of hurricanes and other climate disasters. It's far less than the amount that we're spending on health and asthma and issues that are caused by the air pollution from fossil fuels use. So if you think of it that way, it's kind of a bargain. And I also like to make the joke that what else can you buy for $130 a ton? Like some sand, maybe rocks, not just cheap stuff. So this is a pretty good deal if we're using this to really clean up the pollution in our atmosphere. The great thing that comes with it is an enormous number of new jobs, 440,000 jobs across the nation, and those are certainly going to be concentrated. And this is an area in the country, I think, that would be the first to sort of develop that new workforce. There are already companies right here in Livermore that are working in this space. So how do we get from here to there? This is our best guess, and I'm going to ask you to mostly just focus on the figure that's on the left-hand side. In the green and the yellow, those are the forest management, cropland management systems. And you'll see that the amount per year of carbon that they can remove from the air is relatively modest, but we start right now. We really do. We start now by sucking up carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in trees and in soils. It takes more time for direct air capture or bikers facilities to get built. There's serious capital investment needed. So that ramp up is going to be slower. And I would encourage you to spend some time thinking about that and talking about that today, because those dotted lines in the purple and blue of how we get from today to 2050, those are our best guesses. We really need your thoughts about how to encourage that investment, ask this industry to start to self-sustain. Right now, a lot of investment is coming from the federal government. It's a $2 billion industry. But again, it needs to get to hundreds of billion dollars of investment, and then that industry will be self-sustaining. This is more details about the specific types of processes that we might use. It's a sort of a McKinsey diagram that tells us the cost curve. What I mostly want to just tell you is that for a large amount of the removals that we need, we can do it at somewhere around $100 a ton. That's a bit of a kind of a magic number for the government right now, because we don't want to get into the many, many hundreds per ton. We're trying to keep those costs down. To make carbon removals happen with forests and with soils, that can be done for tens of dollars. It's really pretty cheap. And again, so I would encourage that kind of work is what we really need to take advantage of in the near term. And it's starting to happen. So I'm going to go through some maps of where we see the opportunity across the U.S., but I'll go pretty quickly because I want to get to really what the local opportunities are. This is our analysis of cropland soils. I'll admit that we really focused on the large commodity crops, which California doesn't really make. We don't do corn, soy, wheat, cotton, not to any great extent. So there certainly are opportunities here in California. They just didn't make it into this particular analysis. But the key thing that as a nation we need to encourage, as well as here in California, is keeping green cover on the land all year round. And that means cover crops, for the most part. We got a lot of land in the U.S. where growers and farmers are familiar with cover cropping. They like doing it because it keeps their soil healthy. But for various reasons, they don't make time. Or they make time 1 out of 3 years. There could be investments that might come from the USDA that might change that calculus, and keeping that photosynthetic blanket, as it were, on the landscape, pushing carbon into soils is the thing that we think would make the biggest difference. Our forests are super important to continue their ability to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Here in the western U.S., we have sort of a different answer than they have out in the east, where they typically get a lot more rainfall, and it's more spread throughout the year. We really need to focus on managing the forests so that they are less likely to burn. Because when they burn, that CO2 is being released immediately back to the atmosphere. So it's a little counterintuitive, but by taking trees out of the forest and creating more space between trees, you make it a healthier forest. It can capture more carbon because it's less likely to burn. So it's when you factor in all of those realities, you get to the point where we realize that we could be removing upwards of 1.5 billion tons of CO2 simply through managing our forests and creating a lot of very useful biomass at the same time, which I'll talk more about in a second. This is a facility where you're seeing they're doing a thinning operation, a logging operation, and there's a lot of biomass that is being removed. Some of it is possibly merchantable timber. It might be going to a product, a long life wood product, like houses or other materials that'll last for several hundred years. That's great. But some of it at this point is really just either burned or allowed to decompose. And that's really a loss in my mind. And we think about sometimes the value that's embodied in that material. And instead of thinking about what you could burn it and create electricity out of, that's one thing to do with biomass. What if we really valued the carbon itself? It's truly so much more valuable in an economic sense than just the electrons that you get from burning wood. And this is a map of California where we've highlighted particular counties that have a lot of opportunity to take biomass and convert it to a useful fuel. I'll talk more about those in a second, but hydrogen's kind of at the top of the list, while at the same time capturing CO2 in that process. And in the counties up in Northern California, I've talked to those folks, they are just literally drowning in biomass. They don't have anywhere to put it. They don't have anywhere to do with it. There are facilities that were burning it to simply make electricity. A couple of those have shut down. There's a huge opportunity to use this material for good. In the southern part of the state, a lot of the dark green that you see down there near San Diego and LA, those are largely because of municipal sources of the waste, again, that I call it the green bin kind of waste, but things that come from usually human sources. So, a lot of different biomass conversion properties. Again, I'm going to point to my colleague Sarah Baker, who's here with us, because she can tell you a lot more about those details. But we can take biomass from different sources. It can be wet, manures, or dry, like those forest wastes. Use combustion, pyrolysis, anaerobic digestion. There's a different kind of process, chemical process, that's going to be appropriate to each feedstock. And then produce a number of different products. The product is a sellable product, right? It's something like hydrogen or a liquid fuel, could be heat or power or methane. That has value in our economy today. But I want to remind you, that's not the main reason we're carrying out this biker's process. The main reason we're doing that is to capture the carbon. Because as you're making that hydrogen, you can be concentrating the CO2 and then storing that durably. So that's the real goal here, is that there's a real win-win. We looked at 27 different pathways. I'll spare you the details and just say hydrogen comes out on the top in a lot of cases. We also looked at using biomass to make sustainable airline fuel. That is a national need, and we want many, many millions of tons of SAF by sustainable airline fuel by in the next 10 to 15 years. But overall, we have an opportunity to remove 700 to 900 million tons of CO2 a year through all of these different processes. But it was going to take a lot of facilities. And these facilities, each of these little marks on the graph here, or the map, is really a new one, because we don't have many of these built as yet. We have corn ethanol plants in the Midwest. But these are facilities that would need to be outfitted differently because they would be doing these pyrolyses, these other kinds of approaches. So finding the capital put to build these and to build the infrastructure to support them is a significant hurdle that we're going to have to think about overcoming. I'll say, though, that here in California, again, we've got lots of that biomass. This is just where it is sort of spread across the Central Valley in particular. Most of it, at least in the Central Valley, is coming from agriculture. But again, the Sierras are not far away, so there's a lot of forestry as well. Just show you a couple of images of these kinds of facilities. This is the Phoenix Energy Plant in North Fork in California, and then the Wabash one, we were just over in Indiana, so I was thinking of that one. And these are facilities that are taking biomass and converting it to fuels and have the ability to capture CO2 as well. But again, price tag is something we really need to think about. $500 million to put up one of these facilities is clearly a hurdle. All right, I want to get to our last removal approach. And again, this is carbon dioxide that is at ambient concentrations in the air. Direct air capture literally sucks that in, concentrates it. I mentioned the Heirloom facility in Tracy, California. None of these pilot plants are operating at scale yet. Some of these plants are, if on a good year, going to remove 1,000 tons. That is nowhere near the scale we need to eventually get to. We need to talk about hundreds, if not millions of tons. And that is going to take scale up. But that right now is seeing large investment from the federal government. So this process, as I mentioned, you can use a couple of different technologies. Both liquid and solid sorbents are being studied and being used. At Lawrence Livermore, we have a team that's looking into sort of even the next generation. There are many others who are thinking about those. The big concern with direct air capture is once you have caught those CO2 molecules, to then desorb them and regenerate your sorbent material takes a lot of energy. And right now we're in a world where we're limited by energy. We're trying to decarbonize, right? We're trying to electrify everything in the country. We really don't want to be stealing from our national electric grid to fuel direct air capture. That might slow down the decarbonization process. We absolutely don't want to have that kind of competition happening. So we did an analysis of where in the country do you have the ability to build de novo or totally new renewable energy. It might be from solar or wind or geothermal, but it would be purpose-built for a DAC facility. And it turns out it's mostly in the Intermountain West. There's some opportunities here in California, but they're more modest. And that potential, whether it's up in Wyoming or down up into Texas, is really quite significant, that you could have both the energy and the direct air capture going on in the same place. And also, what I'll show you in a second, the injection of CO2 deep in the ground. So let me skip ahead to that. And that is imaged here. This is just for the state of California, a whole bunch of different regions, largely in the Central Valley, where we have excellent geology for storing CO2 in the ground. And when I talk about storing geologic formation CO2, I'm talking a mile and a half down. These are rock formations that in some cases used to hold fossil energy. In many cases are saline aquifers or below that they're porous rock that you can imagine. It's almost like being at the beach. And if you spill a can of Coke, right, it's absorbed into that material. So the pore spaces that we're talking about injecting this CO2 into are tiny, tiny spaces. But there's actually enormous volume to safely hold CO2. And if the wells are done in the most modern way, we actually have caps of other types of rock formation that hold that CO2 deep within the earth and prevent any kind of seismicity, prevent any release up at the surface. So this is just a map of where the sort of good places are in the country to do geologic storage. Anywhere that you see a dark green color is really excellent. So certainly down in the Gulf states, in the Central Valley, we've got that region up kind of Wyoming all the way down to Texas, also where we just were in Indiana. But there are other places in the country that are less ideal because they just don't have the right kind of rock formations underlying. So the last part of our analysis that is so important, and again here I want to point to my co-author, Kim Mayfield, who did this work, is that we've tried to look at what are the cross-cutting effects of removing CO2 in all these different ways on our ecosystem's health, on our own health, on what we call the Environmental and Equity Justice Analysis, or EEJ. And we looked at both risks and benefits. So these are just three. We looked at over 20 different metrics, but this right here, we're looking at social vulnerability. The folks' kind of balance of their take-home pay and their overall health, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? How would it be affected by these industries? How would soil erosion, how would those forever chemicals that we call PFAS be affected by the amount of new trucking or new industry or phase out of old industries with a buildup of carbon dioxide removal? So again, I'm not going to talk about all those details, but I'll encourage you to look at the report if you're interested in that space. So wrapping up, I just want to say it's so clear to me that there's enthusiasm, there's great opportunity here in the state of California for carbon dioxide removal and carbon management writ large. We have this agricultural core that has an enormous amount of biomass, but also the potential for storage. We've got a lot of know-how. And that's all the way from Stockton down to Kern County. We've got folks who actually know how to drill those wells safely and manage carbon dioxide. We have forests that, as I made clear, and I think you already know, need to be thinned to mitigate the wildfire, and that biomass can be used. And so there are a number of different sort of launching off points that I think that this conversation today and in going to the future needs to think about. How do communities come to decide what's most appropriate? We've talked about what the sort of physical resources are and what makes sense in a little impartial economic analysis. But this is about people's livelihoods, where they live. There's certain folks who are excited about doing geologic storage underneath their land, and there's others who are going to be more cautious. And we need those folks to be at the table and part of the conversation. We need the growers, those farmers, to be part of the conversation, and we need to know what the incentives would have to be for them to change practices. So again, I'll just mention that this is a $2 billion industry. We're down at the low end of the cost curve right now. This is an analysis of how most industries scale. And we need to get out of the formative phase that we're currently in here by proving that this technology works, setting up those pilot plants, building acceptance throughout our communities, but building that acceptance by inviting community members in to have that dialogue and educating, which is why I think it's so important here at Chabot Las Positas that you are understanding that it's need, but also helping to educate your students about the opportunities in this space. And then what we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about is how do we get from here to there? How do we do that scale up? Because a lot of things that we can do in a pilot plant or maybe even at the laboratory scale, we just don't have the time to do a sort of very measured scale up slowly one by one. We really need to kind of leapfrog across scales to get to millions and eventually billions of tons of removals. So I wanted to just wrap up by telling you a little bit more about what we at the Lawrence Livermore Lab are doing in this space. And I'm going to kind of go quickly and just step through all these pieces. The Carbon Initiative, which Sally mentioned that I am now leading, it was started by Roger Ains, our chief energy scientist, is really an umbrella organization of scientists at the lab who are excited about being catalysts for removing carbon from the atmosphere. So that might be learning the techniques, the new technology. It might be doing these national analyses. For some of us, it's working with communities. We have a lot of folks, including some in the audience, who are working on what we call community benefit plans. And all that work is incredibly important for developing this new economy, the new carbon economy. The other thing that I'll point to us, the team's doing right now is working on what we call MRV, which is measurement, reporting, and verification. When these companies are removing CO2 from the atmosphere, they want to get a tax credit. They want to get it, there needs to be a marketplace for that. But we need to prove it happened. And we need to prove that it happened in a reliable way that the marketplace can agree is socially acceptable. And so just simply developing that framework is something that our team is really focused on right now. We're also focused on a whole series of different direct air capture hubs and decarbonization products. I can't even go through all these, but just a whole, you can see they're all spread across both California and the West. And these are mostly federal investments that our team is playing a role in. And we are not the lead. We are almost always a supporter, and we work with the Livermore Lab Foundation to support industries that are partnering often with academic institutions to try and, again, build up these new opportunities to remove carbon dioxide from the air. These are just a couple of additional ones, a partnership down in with Cal State Bakersfield and with folks out in the agricultural sector, and also looking at the opportunities to do carbon capture and storage from industrial facilities here in the state. So a lot of these are all have really nice reports and things that we can make available to you. But I just wanted to show you we kind of really a diversity of kind of work that we're doing in this space. And we really want to be, as I say, a catalyst, a resource for the community. We really don't need that work to be centrally located at Livermore. We want to bring our help where you need it. So I'll wrap up by just thanking the wonderful team that helped with this report. And if we have time, I'm happy to answer a question or two.
I've got a microphone here for anybody that has any questions for Jennifer. Great, we've got some over here already. All right.
Thank you for the excellent talk. When I give a talk on climate, I talk about the difference between can, should, and will. And one of the things that you have not touched about is the regulatory environment and the permitting timeline and all that sort of stuff, which I heard a talk on a forum on sustainable airfield where there was a person from the Center for Biological Diversity who was opposed to forest thinning, CO2 injection, pyrolysis, and virtually everything you talked about.
Wow. Wow.
And so I would just like you to reflect on that.
Oh, gosh. All right. Well, I want to have those dialogues. I don't want to avoid those. I think they're absolutely important. And you brought up several topics there, but let me start with the permitting in the regulatory space. For geologic storage, we have very, very few of the new what's called Class 6 wells that have been approved by the U.S. EPA. There's a wonderful tracker online where you can look at how all of the current applications are doing. I think the one for the CRC Corporation down in Kern County is likely to be approved in this December. One for our colleagues with the Pelican industry up in Stockton, it's probably going to be sometime next year. But there are applications that are in progress. And those wells are going to be really state of the art. There's nothing like them currently. They need to be monitoring CO2 in really, really careful ways that have not currently been done. So I think it's we're on the cusp of seeing a real transformation in that space because the regulatory part of our government is it's moving slowly. We'll admit, but that is going to really open up opportunities for injecting CO2 in the ground. Heirloom, the company that's out in Tracy, their CO2 is currently going into cement. Apparently there's a sidewalk somewhere in San Jose where you can walk across it, but they don't have a way to do injection in the ground yet. That would be true also for our colleagues at Charm who are building bio-oil and they want to inject that. So we do need to be careful about making sure that we're ecologically and geologically careful, and that's what the regulation structures are for. Biodiversity impacts, the things that you also alluded to there with your colleague who doesn't like forest thinning. I'm happy to have those conversations. I think we probably don't have time right this morning, but I'll just say I have a degree in forestry, and I'll say foresters across the country will tell you the right thing to do with our western forests is to bring them back to the stand density that they were originally at when we allowed forests to happen on a sort of normal 20 to 40 year cycle. The native communities in this state have known that for millennia. And so the biodiversity concerns can be absolutely, we can be careful about that while still managing our forests. Yeah.
Next question. Anybody else here?
Plastered. Feng with a startup working on food waste prevention. Excellent work. I know the focus here is on removal. I wonder what is the assumption about the carbon production? So what's, how do you see the importance of cutting down the emission?
Yeah, I try to say that as often as I can, that this is a 10 to 15% that needs to be on top of the big work we knew in simply stopping the emissions. I don't like to say it's the last 10% because we just don't have the time left to do decarbonization first and then do carbon removal. They have to happen at the same time. I would argue they're not competing for the same federal or industry investment dollars. There really is a lot of investment in both right now. It's more about public acceptance and public education that we need both, and we can hold both those things in our hearts and hands, and they're not in competition. I will also just say, though, in all of our analyses, we'd made sure that the carbon dioxide removal didn't somehow cause more emissions. And that's important, particularly in soils. If you're switching to bioenergy crops, you want to make sure that those crops are not actually releasing more nitrous oxide or methane or whatever than the counterfactual scenario, the business as usual scenario with that land.
Okay, another question. Oh, right here.
Hi. It looks like a lot of the work in California is, other than forestry in the north, is Central Valley. What is your experience with the farmers, people in agriculture, whatever, that are going to be responsible for working with you to make these changes?
Yeah, I'll be blunt. What they say to me is, gosh, carbon is not the top of my list right now. Water is at the top of my list. I happened to be down at Kern County right as we had those giant floods. This is now 2 years ago. So they had too much water after having had too little. Both are a problem. and managing water and what we sometimes call aquifer recharge, or literally just getting it back deep in the ground so that it is available for those lean years, is top of list for these farmers. But at the same time, while they're facing a Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is changing their access to water, they can no longer burn. So when those orchards need to be cut down and regenerated, what do they do with all that biomass? Well, now I actually maybe as a grower do care about that carbon because I got to get rid of it. So that's where I see their interest. It's not necessarily yet in a opportunity or a money-making sense. It's just, how do I manage my farm in a way that keeps my yield sustainable? I'll just allude to one other really neat thing, and I'm going to point to Kim Mayfield, who's sitting in the audience. We're really excited about new spaces in agriculture that combine decarbonization with maintenance of healthy soils, and that's agrivoltaics, so PV panels that are over crops. And those can actually, in some of the southern and really hot areas of the state, provide some shade the crops need because it honestly gets just too hot and there's too much sun at sometimes. And that is also shelter for our farm workers. So there's some really neat innovations that can help growers both make money at the end of the day, but protect their land and store carbon at the same time.